Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today at this virtual ANSZCoS meeting. And I'm very grateful to the organisers for inviting me to speak to you about the challenges in spinal cord injury research. It's a big topic and you know a lot about it, I'm sure. The problems that we face really that present the challenges are that there are many, many papers published every year, in fact, hundreds. And however you Google it or do a search, you'll find even thousands of papers published every year in spinal cord injury. But as you know, there's little change in the lives of those living with spinal cord injury. So where is it going? What's happening? Some years ago, a number of papers came out looking at the time from the beginning of a project to its implementation into clinical practice in the lives of people with spinal cord injury. And those papers were brought into a manuscript by Bill Barrable and published in about 2015, showing that the time from the beginning of a research project to its implementation is as long as 17 years. 17 years, of course, means that many projects that would have been useful have been superseded and they never get implemented anyhow, and people with spinal cord injuries don't benefit. So there are some big problems there and challenges we face. If you look at the research process, which we think of as a continuum, we see that it's actually discontinuous. The basic science research in the laboratory doesn't necessarily go to clinical trials at all. And that's partly because the academics don't have a clinical association and the clinicians don't have an academic association. And much of the academic work is done to discover things, not with a purpose in mind or even a thought that they might have application for those with spinal cord injury. Other than the drug companies, which are specifically looking for drugs, but not for spinal cord injury, often for treatment of, say, epilepsy. And we know that some of those drugs which weren't good for epilepsy just happened to turn out to be good for spasm and neuropathic pain. But they're incidental, they're not focused on spinal cord injury. So there's a gap there. And that means that a lot of basic science dies, as it were, at that point, from the point of view of those with spinal cord injury. The clinical research studies that we do are often small. In fact, majority are so small that there's no valid conclusion. And they end with the terms like, looks promising, more research needed. And the researcher doesn't go on to do a bigger study because, one, he's already put in an application for a grant for another project, can't use the project that we're talking about because the results aren't analysed and published. And also the pool of people that he has to join in the study have been taken up with the pilot study that are not enough for a big study. So again, there's this discontinuous gap. There's between the pilot study and the multi-centre study, the big study. That's another valley of death. And that is also then translated into the big clinical study, which should have definitive outcomes. They don't very often occur because the pilot study people don't have enough patients, and the other centres don't work with them. There's not a common research collaborative approach. So when they do have a multi-centre study or a big study that has definitive outcomes, the results are presented at a scientific meeting and published in a journal, and that's it. Another discontinuous part of the research process, another valley of death before implementation. And why is that? Many reasons. One is that the researcher has done their bit and it's up to others to implement it. Two, the people who are responsible for implementing research are health departments and compensating bodies and so on. They're run by managers now who don't know anything about spinal cord research, spinal cord injury, don't read the papers published in journals, don't go to meetings, and are reliant on what the hospital administrators tell them. And for the hospital administrators, spinal cord injury is usually a very small part of their hospital in terms of number of admissions. And in the state or the country or the region, they're a very small proportion of people requiring hospital services. And there is no component of the social and mental health issues, which of course are never covered by basic science anyhow. And they are not really the major focus of a spinal cord service as traditionally run. So if we look at those processes, we find that firstly, the academic laboratory-based research involves a team of researchers, and they work with animals, often very genetically identical animals or very similar, nude mice, Wistar rats, and those animals are brought up in a very controlled research environment. They have the same food, they have the same day and night lighting requirements, they have the same exercise capabilities, and so it's really a researcher-run process which the animals have no basic say. But the clinical research also has a research team, but that research team has the researchers, but also people with spinal cord injury who are not like the laboratory animals. They are not genetically the same, they do not have the same injury, they have different economic and social circumstances, living arrangements, different aspirations in life, and the ability to choose or not to be part of the research study. So the clinical research revolves around the researchers and the people with spinal cord injury in a shared endeavour in order to get the best outcomes. Some of these issues were brought up at a big meeting held by the Rick Hansen Institute, now the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute in Vancouver in 2016. And the results of that large meeting of researchers, clinicians, people with spinal cord injury, stakeholders of all sorts, was brought together into the Praxis Action Plan, published in 2017, in which you can still see, and I would think it would be valuable for you to look at on the Praxis website. So we've dealt with two of the stakeholder groups, the researchers and clinicians, and those with spinal cord injury. One needs to remember also that the other major stakeholders are the funders. Those basically research, like NH and MRC type organisations, also government compensating bodies, industry, etc. But also there's the community programs and services that are run usually by health departments and their agencies and services. And one should almost always remember that the social services are part of the funding component that needs to be looked at, particularly now National Disability Service in Australia that is now established. So if we look at the people with spinal cord injury as an important component of the research process and the research projects that we're talking about, they need to be brought into the process. A network of them needs to become part of the research team. They need to participate in partnership with researchers, and they have a major impact in the direction of the research. So when we look at consumers in research, those with a spinal cord injury need to be able to participate in research. They should be. It's about them. They have the vested interest in the outcomes. They have the most need for the research, if you like. But they don't necessarily have a good understanding of the research process. They've not necessarily done science degrees. They've not necessarily been brought up in a research environment. And they need to be helped and encouraged to understand the research process so that they can be empowered to be participants in that process. So consumer engagement programs are not just finding resources for them, but also assisting people to actively understand the research process. And then when they are really au fait with research, they can be a great help in articulating the research questions and the research they want to participate in. That gives them ownership of the project and, of course, encourages their participation in their own research, which is meaningful to them. They can also help devise protocols that are practical for them. It's no good having a protocol that requires the participants to be at a hospital at 8 o'clock in the morning for a fasting blood test if they live 2 hours away or their carers don't come till 8:30. So they can make protocols practical for the spinal cord injured community to participate. Their participation in the project as consumers is very important in funding too, because a lot of funders are very encouraged to fund a program when they see that the people with spinal cord injury are involved and clearly they see that there's a good likelihood of a benefit for the community, therefore the community that they're supposed to support as funders. So consumer participation is very, very important. And finally, Probably the most important in some ways is consumers are the best advocates for implementation of definitive positive research outcomes. The researchers publish it in journals and go to meetings. They tell their hospital administrators and so on what is current and what should be done, but they are not well heard because the administrators are the ones that go to the health departments and the compensating bodies. The professionals don't have any say anymore. The age of professionals is past, but it's the age of managers, hospital managers, health department managers, and so on. And they don't know very much about research or even spinal cord injury. And so there is no opportunity for the researcher to go directly to the health policy makers and those responsible for implementing health policy. But consumers can. Consumers can go direct through their elected representative. Consumers can go directly to the media, the third estate, and bring to the attention of the public, and therefore the health department, what studies need to be implemented because they've had statistically significant, scientifically valid outcomes that will benefit them and their community. So consumers have achieved now a really vital role in the research process. So we need to bridge those gaps between pilot projects and definitive studies, and that requires a changing of thinking from my research, the researcher keeping the research within his boundaries so that no one else gazumps him and takes the research and publishes and gets the credit, to our research, which is researchers and consumers. It's also that research group of researchers, consumers, working with other groups of researchers and consumers to have multi-center studies, and that our research process is required to have collaborative multi-center studies which will achieve the numbers of participants to result in statistically significant outcomes. So this requires researchers, which is researchers professionally, and consumers as major stakeholders to work together. Multi-center collaborative research requires infrastructure for collaboration, and the Praxis Action Plan calls for online platforms for the researcher groups to meet and work together, developing research questions, protocols, etc. And that's the sort of thing that the Spinal Research Institute has established with the Spinal Cord Research Hub, SCORE. And I would recommend that you look SCORE up and join, put up your research questions, put up your research requests for collaborators, join a group, start a group, and get this process moving. Capacity building is also required for collaboration. And so this means there's a need for support of researchers to engage in collaborative research, particularly early career researchers and consumers with spinal cord injury. They need to have the knowledge and the confidence to participate in the research process. Capacity building also is about building networks, not just confidence, but networks. Networks are not solely achieved. In fact, they're only partly achieved by attendance at international meetings like ANSZCoS, through travel grants and collaboration grants. The networks need to be linking experienced researchers with those less experienced and who need support. The networks need to supply and develop research questions and protocols by supporting things through the platforms, and support funding applications. That's where research needs to actually also move forward. One funder in one area, maybe only for veterans or maybe only for a state or a territory, may not in fact fund all the necessary services in the multi-center study. So there's a great need for this collaborative working together of those three stakeholder groups. So in conclusion, the challenges are to bridge the gaps between the various components of the research process, to engage researchers actively in the research process, and to develop the researcher-consumer advocacy for research outcomes and funding. So we need to be looking very carefully about how we change the paradigm of research from the laboratory-based research paradigm to what is now really required, a clinically based, multi-stakeholder, common approach to research. Thank you.